Harper Monroe learned the sound of betrayal before she fully understood it. The hollow vibration of her phone against the chipped wooden table of her tiny Brooklyn apartment. The way her chest tightened before her brain could catch up. The instinctive dread that bloomed the second she saw her girlfriend's name light up the screen and then vanish, replaced by a notification she was never meant to see. A message preview that was not meant for her. A name she didn't recognize paired with a heart emoji that felt like a blade sliding slowly between her ribs. And suddenly it was Christmas Eve and the city outside her window was glowing with lights meant for joy while Harper sat frozen, breath shallow, staring at the truth she could not unsee. The confirmation arriving seconds later in the form of silence, then excuses, then the flat, exhausted honesty that came after the lie collapsed under its own weight. "I didn't plan for it to happen, I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd find out." Words that felt rehearsed, empty, incapable of filling the cavern they left behind. And by the time the call ended, Harper was alone in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had abandoned her. She didn't cry at first because shock held her upright, because there was rent overdue and job applications unanswered, and a refrigerator humming with more noise than food inside it, because all her friends were already posting airport selfies and family dinners and matching pajamas, because New York during the holidays could make loneliness feel like a personal failure, and because grief sometimes arrives as numbness before it becomes pain. She put on her coat without remembering doing it, wrapped a scarf around her neck with hands that trembled just enough to annoy her, and walked until the cold burned her cheeks, and the streets blurred into one long stretch of glowing storefronts and laughter that wasn't hers. The cafe on the corner of 7th and Maple had always been a refuge. Warm lights, chipped mugs, the smell of espresso and cinnamon masking the ache of being broke and directionless, and Harper ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, wrapped her hands around the cup as if it might anchor her, and stared out the window pretending she was just another person passing time instead of someone whose life had quietly cracked open. That was when the woman appeared, elegant in a way that felt almost out of place among the thrift store coats and hurried commuters, tailored wool in a deep navy, dark hair pulled back with careful restraint, posture perfect but eyes betraying something frantic, searching, and Harper noticed her only because the woman hesitated, because she paced once outside the cafe as if rehearsing courage, and because when she finally stepped inside, she looked directly at Harper like someone spotting the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. The woman approached slowly, uncertainty written into every step, and when she spoke her voice was low, controlled, carrying an accent of old money Harper couldn't quite place. "Excuse me, I'm so sorry to bother you." This is going to sound completely unhinged, and Harper almost laughed despite herself because it was the first honest thing she'd heard all day. "I'm Charlotte Ashford," the woman continued, fingers twisting together in a gesture that clashed with her polished exterior. "And I know we don't know each other, but I am in a very difficult situation, and you look like someone who might understand desperation," which was perhaps the strangest compliment Harper had ever received. Harper raised an eyebrow, skepticism warring with curiosity, and gestured to the empty chair across from her because at worst it would be a story, something to distract her from the echo of her apartment, and Charlotte sat, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath for hours. What followed felt surreal, words tumbling out too fast. A wealthy family estate in Connecticut, Christmas and New Year's gatherings steeped in tradition and expectation, conservative parents determined to parade eligible men in front of their only daughter like offerings, a grandmother whose approval carried the weight of law, and a lie already told. "I said I was bringing my girlfriend," Charlotte confessed, cheeks flushing. "I said it because I panicked and because it was easier than explaining my life to them again. And now I need someone to pretend to be her." Harper stared, waiting for the punchline that didn't come, the cafe noise fading until all she could hear was her own heartbeat and the faint crackle of the espresso machine. "I'll pay you," Charlotte added quickly, $5,000 plus travel, food, everything covered. "It would only be for a week, just through New Year's, and I swear I will make it as easy as possible." Harper's first instinct was to say no, because she wasn't an actress, and because lying to a stranger's family sounded like the kind of chaos she usually avoided. But then reality intruded, $5,000 translating instantly into rent paid, groceries stocked, breathing room, she hadn't felt in months, and the alternative waiting for her was a silent apartment and a city that didn't care if she fell apart quietly. She asked practical questions to hide the way her pulse quickened: rules, boundaries, expectations, and Charlotte answered them all with earnest intensity. No touching unless necessary, separate beds if you want. I just need them to believe we're together, that I'm happy. And there was something in her eyes then, a vulnerability that slipped through the cracks of her composure, a plea that went beyond money. Harper agreed before she could overthink it, the word yes leaving her mouth like a leap off a cliff, and Charlotte smiled with such raw relief that Harper felt an unexpected twist in her chest, as if she'd just done something that mattered. They exchanged numbers, finalized details, and when Charlotte left the cafe she paused, turned back, and said softly, "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me," and Harper watched her go, wondering when her life had become something that could pivot on a stranger's need. That night Harper packed a borrowed suitcase with clothes that didn't quite fit the image she imagined of old money hallways and formal dinners, her mind replaying Charlotte's voice, her posture, the careful way she'd said girlfriend as if testing the word, and despite everything, despite the lie looming ahead, Harper felt something stir beneath the exhaustion, a spark of anticipation, of being pulled into a story bigger than her heartbreak. She didn't know yet that the Ashford mansion would be warm and suffocating, that eyes would linger on her longer than politeness required, that Charlotte's reserved facade would begin to crack in quiet moments, or that pretending could become the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. But as she zipped the suitcase and glanced at her reflection, she realized this Christmas would not be about survival alone. It would be the beginning of something that refused to stay fake. Harper had always believed that places carried weight, that walls absorbed the lives lived inside them, and as the black town car pulled through wrought iron gates and along a winding driveway lined with bare trees dusted in snow, she felt that weight settle on her shoulders long before the mansion itself came into view, the Ashford estate rising from the white landscape like something preserved in time. All stone and tall windows glowing warmly against the early dusk, beautiful in a way that felt intimidating rather than inviting. And Harper's first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity of it all, at the fact that less than 24 hours ago she'd been crying into a cheap pillow in Brooklyn, and now she was stepping into a world that looked like it belonged in old photographs and whispered expectations. Charlotte sat beside her, posture perfect, yet hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the approaching front doors as if bracing for impact, and Harper noticed the subtle tension she carried now that they were no longer strangers in a cafe, but accomplices in a carefully constructed lie, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable, charged with unspoken rules and fragile trust. "You don't have to perform the second you walk in," Charlotte murmured as the car slowed, voice low and controlled but threaded with anxiety. "Just be yourself. They'll like you." And Harper almost smiled at that, because it was clear Charlotte wasn't entirely convinced. The doors opened before they even reached them, a woman stepping forward with practiced grace, tall and impeccably dressed, eyes sharp and assessing as they flicked from Charlotte to Harper and lingered there just a second longer than politeness required. "Charlotte, darling," she said, arms opening, and Charlotte leaned into the embrace with familiarity that spoke of obligation rather than comfort, before turning slightly, a hand hovering near Harper's back as if unsure whether to touch her. "This is Harper," she said, "my girlfriend," the word landing between them with unexpected gravity. The woman's expression softened instantly, a smile blooming that felt curated but sincere enough to be disarming. "Harper, welcome. I'm Eleanor Ashford, Charlotte's mother. We're so happy you could join us for the holidays." And she took Harper's hands without waiting for permission, squeezing them warmly, eyes scanning her face, as if cataloging details for later analysis. Harper smiled, offered a polite greeting, and felt the strange sensation of being both invisible and under a microscope, aware that every word and movement was being measured against an invisible standard she didn't know the rules to. Inside, the mansion was even more overwhelming, ceilings high enough to echo footsteps, garlands and lights arranged with elegant restraint, the scent of pine and expensive candles mingling with something older, something like tradition baked into the air, and Harper's worn boots fell out of place against polished floors that reflected the chandelier light. Before she could fully orient herself, another presence entered the space, a woman older than Eleanor but sharing the same sharp eyes and commanding posture, her hair silver and perfectly styled, a cane resting lightly in her hand more as symbol than necessity, and Charlotte stiffened almost imperceptibly. "This must be the famous girlfriend," the woman said, voice smooth and authoritative, and Charlotte swallowed. "Grandmother, this is Harper," and Harper met the older woman's gaze head-on, refusing to look away despite the instinct to shrink, something defiant sparking in her chest. "I'm Margaret Ashford," the matriarch continued, "and I must say, you are not at all what I expected," which could have been an insult or a compliment, but the small smile that followed suggested approval, or at least intrigue. Dinner that night was a performance Harper hadn't rehearsed enough for, a long table filled with relatives she couldn't immediately place, conversations flowing easily around investments and philanthropy and legacy, and yet every so often the focus shifted sharply to her, questions posed with polite curiosity that hid deeper intent. "How did you and Charlotte meet? What do you do in New York? How long have you been together?" And Harper answered honestly where she could, vague where she couldn't, feeling Charlotte's eyes on her more often than the family's, a silent communication passing between them as Charlotte subtly steered conversations away from dangerous territory, their supposed relationship growing more detailed by necessity, small lies stacking on top of each other like cards. It was strange how quickly the family embraced her, laughter at her dry humor, nods of approval when she challenged an outdated comment with gentle wit, Eleanor's hand resting on Harper's arm a little too often, Margaret watching with a satisfied glint that made Harper uneasy, and by the time dessert was served there was an unspoken understanding that Harper belonged here, at least for now. Later, when they were finally alone in the bedroom Charlotte had prepared for them, the tension broke like a wave, both of them exhaling at once, laughter bubbling up unexpectedly. "Can you believe that just worked?" Charlotte whispered, leaning back against the door, and Harper laughed too, the sound freer than she'd felt in days. "I think your grandmother scares me more than the idea of lying to her," she admitted, and Charlotte smiled, a genuine one that softened her entire face. The room was spacious, a four-poster bed dominating the center. A single bed, Harper noted, her eyebrows lifting, and Charlotte flushed slightly. "I told them we were comfortable sharing," she said quickly. "I can sleep on the couch if you want, or we can figure it out." And Harper studied her then, really looked at the woman behind the tailored coats and practiced composure, the tightness around her eyes, the way she held herself like someone constantly bracing for judgment. "It's fine," Harper said, surprising herself with the calm certainty in her voice. "It's just sleeping, right?" And Charlotte nodded, relief washing over her features, though something else flickered there too, something unspoken. As they prepared for bed, brushing teeth side by side, Harper felt the strange intimacy of proximity, the awareness of Charlotte's presence sharp and undeniable, and when they finally lay down, space carefully maintained between them, the silence felt heavier than any conversation, thoughts racing on both sides of the mattress. "Thank you," Charlotte said softly into the dark, "for coming here, for this," and Harper turned her head slightly, meeting her gaze in the low light. "You're welcome," she replied, meaning more than the words implied. Love what you've seen so far and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet and relentless, and Harper stared at the ceiling realizing that leaving this place, leaving Charlotte, might already be more complicated than she'd planned. Morning arrived at the Ashford estate with deceptive gentleness, pale winter light filtering through heavy curtains and settling across the bed where Harper lay awake long before her alarm, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of wealth. No sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, only the distant hum of a house already alive with staff moving silently through hallways, and beside her Charlotte slept on her back, hands folded over her stomach, as if even in sleep she was conscious of taking up space, her face softer now, unguarded, lashes resting against skin that looked almost fragile in the early light, and Harper had to look away because the intimacy of witnessing someone like that felt too real for something built on a lie. They rose carefully, an unspoken choreography already forming between them, brushing teeth side by side again, exchanging small, polite smiles that carried more weight than they should have, and when they stepped into the hallway together, Charlotte's posture shifted instantly, shoulders squaring, expression smoothing into something composed and distant that Harper was beginning to recognize as armor. Breakfast was a formal affair despite the holiday, a long table again, fresh flowers, linen napkins, and conversations already in motion when they arrived, Eleanor greeting them with visible delight, eyes flicking briefly to the way Harper and Charlotte stood close, approval unmistakable, and Margaret observing from the head of the table, with her usual sharp interest, her gaze lingering not on Charlotte, but on Harper, as if measuring her influence. The questions resumed quickly, light and conversational on the surface, but probing beneath. Plans for the day, holiday traditions, what Harper's family was like, and Harper answered honestly where it was safe, her parents gone, friends scattered, work uncertain, and instead of discomfort she was met with sympathy that bordered on possessiveness, Eleanor immediately insisting that Harper was part of the family now, that no one should be alone during the holidays, words that tightened something in Harper's chest because she wasn't supposed to belong here, not really. The day unfolded like a carefully planned production, a walk through the snow-dusted grounds with scarves wrapped close, Charlotte at Harper's side explaining the history of the estate, pointing out landmarks with the detached fondness of someone who'd grown up surrounded by beauty that never quite felt like home, and Harper listened, fascinated by the contrast between privilege and pressure, by the way Charlotte spoke about expectations as if they were whether unavoidable and constant. Inside, there were preparations for Christmas dinner, decorations adjusted, menus discussed, and at some point Eleanor pulled Harper aside under the guise of showing her family portraits, lowering her voice with conspiratorial warmth as she spoke about how happy Charlotte seemed lately, how different, freer, and Harper felt the weight of that responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders, nodding, smiling, playing the role of the grounding presence Eleanor wanted to believe she was. Later, in the library, Margaret joined Harper unexpectedly, settling into a chair across from her with deliberate grace, asking questions that cut closer to the truth than anyone else dared. "What do you want for yourself?" Harper Monroe, and Harper hesitated, caught off guard by the directness, offering a careful answer about stability, about wanting to feel like she mattered. And Margaret studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly, murmuring that honesty was a rare and valuable trait. In this family, words that felt both like praise and warning. By the time evening approached, Harper was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, the constant vigilance of maintaining the lie wearing her down, and when she and Charlotte finally escaped to their room the tension between them crackled, Charlotte pacing, fingers twisting anxiously, apologizing for her family, for the pressure, for the way everything felt like a test, and Harper stopped her mid-spiral, telling her it was okay, that she was handling it, surprising them, both with the sincerity in her voice. They talked then, really talked, sitting on opposite sides of the bed at first, then closer without either of them acknowledging the shift, sharing pieces of themselves that had nothing to do with the agreement, Charlotte admitting how suffocating it felt to live a life already planned for her, Harper confessing the fear of being replaceable, of slipping through the cracks unnoticed. And in those quiet moments the lie felt less like an act, and more like a space where truth could breathe. When Charlotte laughed softly at something Harper said, the sound warm and unguarded, Harper felt it resonate somewhere deep, and when their knees brushed accidentally neither of them moved away, the contact lingering, charged, until Charlotte cleared her throat and stood abruptly, the moment broken but not erased. That night, lying beside each other again, the space between them smaller now, Harper realized with a mix of excitement and dread that the hardest part of this arrangement wouldn't be fooling the Ashfords, it would be convincing herself that what she felt in these moments was still pretend. The pressure no longer crept in quietly. It settled into the house like an unspoken rule, shaping every interaction until Harper became acutely aware that the Ashfords were no longer content with the idea of her and Charlotte together. They wanted visible proof. something tangible they could point to and believe in. It began at breakfast, Eleanor's tone light and affectionate as she remarked on how lovely it was to see Charlotte so relaxed these days, how wonderful it must be to wake up beside someone you trust, her gaze deliberately drifting to the empty space between Harper's chair and Charlotte's. Harper felt heat rise to her cheeks, instinctively shifting closer, and Charlotte followed the movement without thinking, their shoulders brushing in a way that drew immediate satisfaction from Eleanor and a sharp, approving glance from Margaret at the head of the table. That was when Charlotte's hand slipped beneath the tablecloth and found Harper's, fingers tentative at first, then curling gently as if testing the reality of the contact, and Harper inhaled sharply, surprised not by the touch itself, but by how right it felt, how her body responded before her mind could remind her this was supposed to be an act. The rest of the morning unfolded with the same quiet insistence, chairs placed too close together, casual comments about couples' traditions, Eleanor frequently linking her arm through Harper's as they walked through the house, speaking of her as if she were already woven into the family fabric, and Margaret observing it all with measured satisfaction, her approval not gentle but expectant, as if she were daring them to fail. Harper became increasingly aware of Charlotte's duality, the way she navigated the house with practiced composure, while her touches grew bolder, more instinctive, fingers lingering at Harper's wrist, a hand settling briefly at the small of her back to guide her through doorways, gestures that were easy to justify outwardly, but harder to rationalize internally. The line between what was necessary and what was desired blurred further in the afternoon. During tea in the sitting room, sunlight slanting through tall windows as relatives chatted idly until one of Charlotte's aunts leaned forward with a knowing smile and asked, almost casually, how long the two of them had been sharing a room. Harper's pulse spiked, her mind scrambling for a safe answer. But Charlotte spoke before she could, her voice calm and assured as she said every night since Harper arrived, her hand settling on Harper's knee beneath the table with deliberate confidence. The room hummed with approval, laughter following, conversation moving on as if nothing momentous had happened, but Harper remained frozen, hyper-aware of Charlotte's touch, the warmth seeping through fabric, the intimacy of it undeniable, and the most unsettling part was that she didn't want it to stop. When they finally retreated upstairs, the air between them was taut, Charlotte pacing near the window, running a hand through her hair as apologies spilled out, explaining she hadn't planned to say that her family was pushing harder than she expected, that she hadn't meant to cross a boundary. Harper listened quietly before admitting, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she hadn't been uncomfortable, that she understood why Charlotte had done it, that pretending demanded a kind of commitment they couldn't half perform. Charlotte stopped pacing then, turning to face her, eyes searching Harper's face with an intensity that made her chest tighten, confessing softly that it was getting harder to tell where pretending ended and something else began. The admission hung between them, fragile and dangerous, before duty intervened again in the form of preparations for the evening's formal dinner in town, a long-standing Ashford tradition that left no room for casual detachment. Harper watched from the doorway as Charlotte emerged in a deep emerald gown, the fabric hugging her frame in a way that felt almost intimate, her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time, and Harper forgot how to breathe, the realization hitting her all at once that this wasn't performance admiration, it was real, visceral, impossible to ignore. "You look incredible," Harper said before she could stop herself, and Charlotte flushed, something unguarded flickering across her face, a smile softer and more vulnerable than any she'd worn so far. At the dinner, expectations intensified, introductions made with pointed emphasis on their relationship, Charlotte's arm slipping around Harper's waist with increasing ease, fingers resting possessively at her hip, and Harper leaned into the role because it felt simpler than resisting, because Charlotte's closeness grounded her, because every shared glance carried warmth that felt dangerously sincere. It wasn't until they returned to the mansion, the grandeur suddenly oppressive in its silence, that the weight of it all pressed down fully, the realization that they were no longer just deceiving a family, they were deceiving themselves. In the privacy of their room, the tension finally broke, not into anger but into honesty, Harper admitting she was afraid of getting attached to something temporary, Charlotte confessing that Harper had become the only place where she felt like herself, not an heir, not a disappointment, just a woman allowed to exist. They stood close then, breaths mingling, eyes locked, the space between them charged with desire and fear in equal measure, and for one aching moment it felt inevitable that they would cross a line that could never be erased. Charlotte pulled back first, voice trembling as she said they needed to slow down, that if they crossed that boundary there would be no pretending left, and Harper nodded, forcing herself to agree even as disappointment flared sharp and immediate in her chest. They lay down that night closer than before, bodies angled toward each other, not touching but aware of every inch of space, and Harper stared into the dark, understanding that the Ashfords' expectations had pushed them into a proximity that was no longer safe, a closeness that was beginning to feel less like an act and more like a truth neither of them was ready to face. The first crack appeared in the form of laughter that didn't belong to Harper, light and familiar, drifting across the marble-floored foyer late the next afternoon as she descended the staircase alone, drawn by voices she hadn't heard before. She paused instinctively, one hand resting on the banister, and saw Charlotte standing near the fireplace with a man Harper didn't recognize, tall, impeccably dressed, his posture easy in a way that suggested he belonged here, that he had always belonged here. Eleanor stood nearby, smiling brightly, her hand resting on the man's arm as she spoke, the picture of pleased orchestration, and Harper felt something sharp twist low in her chest before she could rationalize it away. This was ridiculous, she told herself immediately. This was expected, inevitable even, and yet her body reacted before her logic could catch up, a flush of heat followed by an unwelcome surge of jealousy she had no right to feel. Charlotte laughed at something the man said, the sound polite but genuine enough to sting, and Harper forced herself to step forward, reminding herself of her role, of the agreement, of the fact that she was being paid to be here, not to feel anything at all. Eleanor's eyes lit up when she noticed Harper, calling her over with enthusiasm, introducing the man as William, a family friend in town for the holidays, the emphasis on friend heavy with implication, and Harper smiled, extending a hand, feeling suddenly underdressed, underqualified, out of place in a way she hadn't before. William's gaze lingered on her with polite curiosity, a flicker of assessment passing through his eyes before he turned his attention back to Charlotte, asking about her work, her plans, the future that Harper knew was already mapped out in painful detail. Charlotte answered smoothly, but Harper caught the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her smile tightened just enough to signal discomfort, and it confused Harper further because part of her wanted to step in, to reclaim the space at Charlotte's side, while another part reminded her that this was exactly the kind of scenario their arrangement was meant to prevent. Dinner that evening was worse. William seated deliberately close to Charlotte, conversations steered toward shared histories and mutual acquaintances, Eleanor watching with thinly veiled hope, Margaret observing silently, her gaze flicking occasionally to Harper as if gauging her reaction. Harper played her part with practiced ease, laughing when appropriate, contributing just enough to remain present without asserting herself, but inside, she felt increasingly displaced, like an understudy watching the lead reclaim her rightful role. When William mentioned a charity gala he and Charlotte had attended years ago, reminiscing fondly, Harper felt the sting sharpen, the reminder that this world existed long before her and would continue long after she left. She told herself she didn't care, that this discomfort was nothing more than pride reacting to irrelevance, but the lie rang hollow even in her own head. Later, in the hallway outside the dining room, Harper overheard Eleanor's voice drop into something more conspiratorial, speaking to Charlotte about how nice it was to see her reconnecting with old friends, how stability mattered, how certain relationships made life easier, and Harper kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard, the words settling heavily in her chest like stones. In their room that night, the distance between the beds felt wider than it had in days, the silence heavier, and Charlotte sensed it immediately, asking what was wrong in a voice that was careful, almost guarded. Harper hesitated, torn between honesty and self-preservation, before finally admitting she felt invisible, like she was playing a role that could be erased the moment something more acceptable walked back into Charlotte's life. Charlotte frowned, confusion quickly giving way to something sharper, defensive, insisting that William meant nothing, that her family had invited him without her input, that Harper shouldn't read into it, and Harper bristled despite herself, pointing out that of course she would read into it, that everything here was designed to remind her she didn't belong. The argument wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it cut deep, both of them circling the real issue without naming it, Harper accusing Charlotte of hiding behind her family when things got complicated, Charlotte accusing Harper of forgetting this was supposed to be simple, transactional, and when the word transactional slipped out it landed like a slap, the silence afterward thick and unforgiving. Harper turned away, staring at the wall, forcing herself not to cry, while Charlotte sat rigid on her bed, breathing shallowly, regret already evident but pride keeping her from retracting the words. They slept poorly, tension humming between them like a live wire, and in the morning Harper woke with a familiar resolve hardening in her chest, the instinct to pull back before she could be pushed aside. She was more distant that day, polite but reserved, responding when spoken to but no longer offering herself so freely, and the family noticed, Eleanor's concern immediate, Margaret's gaze sharpening with curiosity rather than disapproval. Charlotte noticed too, her glances following Harper across rooms, unease creeping into her expression as the space between them grew not from necessity, but from choice. That afternoon, during a walk on the grounds meant to showcase holiday decorations, Charlotte finally confronted her, asking why she was shutting down, and Harper answered honestly, admitting she needed to protect herself, that she couldn't afford to forget this wasn't real when everything around them kept suggesting otherwise. Charlotte listened quietly this time, no defensiveness, just the dawning realization that she was losing something fragile and unexpected, something she hadn't known she wanted until it began to slip away. When Harper walked ahead, leaving Charlotte standing alone among the snow-dusted trees, Charlotte felt the weight of her own fear settle heavily, the fear that in trying to control the narrative of her life, she might be sacrificing the one connection that felt honest, and as Harper reached the edge of the path she felt it too, the ache of wanting to turn back and the stubborn resolve not to, both of them caught in the same moment of fracture, unaware that the distance forming between them would force truths neither could avoid much longer. Distance changed the temperature of the house. Harper felt at the moment she stepped into the dining room that morning, the air no longer warm with easy acceptance, but taut with curiosity, Eleanor's eyes flicking between her and Charlotte with a concern she tried to disguise as cheerfulness, Margaret's gaze sharper, more calculating than before. Harper kept her posture polite, her smiles restrained, careful not to offer more than was asked of her, and it felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to reclaim a sense of self in a place that had begun to swallow her whole. Charlotte, on the other hand, looked unsettled, her composure fraying at the edges as she watched Harper move through the room like a guest rather than a fixture, responding when spoken to but no longer orbiting her, no longer anchoring herself at Charlotte's side. The family noticed immediately, questions surfacing in gentle tones. "Are you feeling well? Harper dear, did you sleep poorly?" And Harper nodded, murmured reassurances, painfully aware that every step back she took forced Charlotte into a spotlight she had never wanted. The tension culminated in an invitation that felt less like a request and more like a test, a charity winter gala hosted by one of the Ashfords' longtime associates, an event steeped in expectation, tradition, and the quiet politics of appearance, and Eleanor insisted it would be good for everyone, a chance to celebrate together, to remind the community that Charlotte was settled, happy, thriving. Harper almost declined, the instinct to retreat screaming in her chest, but Charlotte caught her eye across the room, something raw and pleading flickering there, and Harper agreed despite herself, telling herself she could endure one more performance. The gala was everything Harper feared it would be, glittering lights, expensive gowns, conversations laced with subtle judgments, and she felt like an outsider all over again, hyper-aware of her thrifted dress among couture, her careful silence among confident voices. Charlotte stayed close at first, her hand resting lightly at Harper's back as if afraid she might vanish, but as the evening wore on, obligations pulled her away, introductions demanded, conversations monopolized by people who saw her as a symbol rather than a person. Harper found herself standing alone more than once, nursing a drink she barely tasted, watching Charlotte from across the room as she laughed politely, nodded dutifully, played the role she had been trained for since birth, and for the first time Harper saw her clearly, not as an heiress or a romantic ideal, but as someone profoundly trapped. The realization softened something in her chest even as it hurt, empathy mingling with longing in a way that made it hard to breathe. It was Margaret who finally crossed the distance, appearing at Harper's side with quiet authority, commenting casually on how quickly appearances could deceive, how people often mistook polish for happiness, and Harper met her gaze, surprised by the vulnerability she glimpsed there, a woman who had once made similar sacrifices and learned to live with them. "You matter more than you think," Margaret said quietly, and Harper didn't know if it was a warning or an encouragement. When Charlotte finally returned, tension etched into her features. She found Harper different, calmer, more resolved, and the shift unsettled her deeply. They danced when asked, bodies close out of necessity, and the intimacy felt heavier than before, charged not with excitement but with everything unsaid, Charlotte's grip tightening as if afraid this might be the last time she could reach for Harper, without consequence. Later, in the quiet of the car ride back, the argument they had been avoiding finally surfaced, not explosive but devastating in its honesty, Charlotte admitting she felt like she was failing everyone at once, her family, herself, Harper, and Harper confessing that loving something you can't keep is its own kind of cruelty, even when you pretend it isn't love at all. The words hung between them, dangerous and undeniable, neither of them correcting the implication. Back at the mansion, the silence between them felt heavier than any fight, and when Charlotte reached for Harper's hand in the dark hallway, hesitating just long enough to give her time to pull away, Harper let her, the contact grounding and heartbreaking all at once. They didn't speak again that night, lying in bed turned toward opposite walls, but sleep refused to come, both of them aware that the distance they'd tried to create had only made the truth louder, clearer, impossible to ignore, and that something had shifted irrevocably, the lie beginning to crack not from exposure, but from the weight of feelings neither of them could contain much longer. Suspicion did not announce itself loudly. It seeped into conversations, into glances held a second too long, into questions that sounded affectionate but landed with the precision of a blade. Harper felt it first during breakfast, Eleanor's warmth tempered by a new attentiveness, her inquiries more specific, less forgiving, asking about Harper's work again, about plans after New Year's, about whether she and Charlotte had ever discussed living arrangements beyond the holidays. Harper answered carefully, each word weighed, conscious of Margaret's silence at the head of the table, the older woman watching not with curiosity now but with intent, as if a conclusion was forming behind her eyes. Charlotte seemed equally aware, her posture rigid, her smile slower to appear, tension radiating from her in a way that made Harper ache despite her resolve to keep distance. The house itself felt smaller, corridors narrowing under scrutiny, staff interactions more formal, as though everyone sensed a shift in the current and adjusted accordingly. It was Eleanor who finally voiced what hovered unspoken, requesting a private walk with Harper in the garden under the guise of fresh air, her arm linked through Harper's with maternal familiarity that no longer felt entirely benign. She spoke gently at first, reminiscing about Charlotte as a child, about how sensitive she'd always been, how easily overwhelmed, and then her tone sharpened almost imperceptibly as she asked whether Harper truly understood what it meant to be with someone like her daughter, someone whose life carried obligations most people never had to consider. Harper listened, heart pounding, recognizing the test beneath the concern, and answered with honesty that surprised even herself, admitting she didn't fully understand the Ashford world, but that she cared about Charlotte as a person, not as an extension of her family's expectations. Eleanor studied her closely, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, murmuring that care was admirable but compatibility mattered more, words that lingered like a warning long after the walk ended. That afternoon, the tension escalated when a long-forgotten family friend arrived unexpectedly, an older woman with sharp wit and sharper memory, who casually mentioned Charlotte's past relationship, a discreet but long-term arrangement with a woman whose name Harper recognized only because Charlotte had once almost said it before stopping herself. The mention hit like a cold wave, Charlotte stiffening visibly as the conversation drifted on, Harper's chest tightening as pieces she hadn't known existed suddenly demanded attention. Later, alone in the library, Harper confronted Charlotte quietly, asking who she was, why she'd never mentioned someone so significant, and Charlotte's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She admitted the truth in fragments at first, that she'd loved someone once, deeply, that the relationship had ended not because of a lack of feeling but because of pressure, fear, the impossibility of reconciling love with family expectations. The woman had left, unwilling to live in shadows, unwilling to wait for Charlotte to choose herself, and Charlotte confessed that she hadn't blamed her, only herself, the regret settling so deeply it shaped every choice she'd made since. Harper listened, pain and understanding tangling inside her, realizing that Charlotte's fear wasn't theoretical, it was lived, scarred, reinforced by loss. The revelation changed something fundamental between them, stripping away assumptions and exposing vulnerability raw enough to hurt, and Harper found herself torn between empathy and self-preservation, knowing now exactly how easily she could become another chapter in that same story. That night, Margaret summoned Charlotte alone, a meeting that left her pale and shaken, and when she returned to their room, she confessed that her grandmother knew, not everything, but enough, that she suspected the relationship was not as solid as presented and warned Charlotte against repeating past mistakes. The weight of that warning settled heavily between them, both women understanding its implication, that Harper was being measured not just as a partner, but as a risk. They lay awake side by side, not touching, the silence thick with everything newly exposed, and Harper realized with a hollow certainty that the danger now wasn't discovery alone, it was history, the way patterns repeated when fear went unchallenged, and the terrifying possibility that caring might not be enough to break them. The ultimatum did not arrive as a declaration but as an arrangement, carefully framed as concern, opportunity, protection, and Harper understood its true nature the moment Eleanor invited her for tea alone in the sunroom, the space flooded with winter light and curated serenity that felt almost cruel in contrast to the tension tightening Harper's chest. Eleanor spoke softly, kindly, about how complicated Charlotte's life was, about how fragile her equilibrium could be, about how relationships that burned too brightly too quickly often ended in unnecessary pain, and then she offered Harper something generous and isolating all at once, a short trip back to New York paid in full, time to clear her head, space for Charlotte to focus on family matters without distraction. The implication clear even if the words remained polite, Harper was being removed from the equation for everyone's benefit. Harper listened without interrupting, her hands steady around the porcelain cup despite the storm inside her, and when Eleanor finished, she thanked her calmly, asked for time to think, and walked out with her dignity intact, even as her heart fractured quietly. She didn't go far, retreating instead to the edge of the estate where the snow lay undisturbed beneath bare trees, breath fogging the cold air as she tried to remind herself why she'd come here in the first place. Money, survival, simplicity, none of which explained the ache hollowing her chest now. Charlotte found her there, breathless, coat thrown hastily over her shoulders, eyes searching Harper's face with panic barely contained, having heard just enough from Eleanor to sense what was happening, and the moment their gazes met something in Charlotte broke open. She didn't ask what was said, didn't pretend ignorance. She simply said they're trying to send you away, voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear, and Harper nodded, honesty stripping her bare, admitting she didn't know how to fight a family that spoke in kindness while drawing lines she wasn't allowed to cross. Charlotte's hands curled into fists at her sides, years of obedience and restraint colliding violently with the reality of loss repeating itself, and she confessed in a rush that she couldn't do this again, couldn't watch someone walk away because she was too afraid to choose, the words spilling out raw and unfiltered, fear giving way to resolve for the first time. Harper tried to speak, to caution, to remind Charlotte of consequences and contracts and expectations, but Charlotte stepped closer, closing the distance with a decisiveness that stole Harper's breath, her voice low and fierce as she said she was tired of living her life as a series of acceptable absences, tired of loving people only in private, tired of letting fear dictate who she was allowed to keep. The moment stretched impossibly, the cold forgotten, the world narrowing to the space between them, Harper's pulse roaring in her ears as she searched Charlotte's face for doubt and found none, only certainty edged with terror. When Charlotte reached for her, fingers brushing Harper's jaw with reverent hesitation, it felt less like crossing a line and more like stepping into alignment with something that had been building since that first desperate meeting in a cafe, and Harper didn't pull away, didn't think, didn't negotiate. She leaned in as if her body had been waiting for permission. The kiss was gentle but devastating, soft lips meeting with a tenderness that carried all the restraint they'd practiced and abandoned in the same breath. Charlotte's exhale shaky against Harper's mouth, Harper's hands settling at Charlotte's waist not to claim but to steady, the contact electric in its simplicity, profound in what it admitted without words. They broke apart only long enough to breathe, foreheads pressed together, both trembling, the truth undeniable now, no longer something hovering beneath the surface, but fully realized, irreversible. Charlotte whispered that she didn't care what it cost, that she would face her family, that she wouldn't let Harper become another regret shaped by silence, and Harper believed her because the kiss had not been impulsive, it had been deliberate, chosen. When they returned to the house together, hands brushing openly, eyes clear despite the storm awaiting them, the air felt different, charged not with secrecy but with consequence, and Margaret noticed immediately, her gaze sharp and knowing, Eleanor freezing just long enough to understand what had shifted. Nothing was said that night, not yet, but Harper knew as she lay beside Charlotte, their hands intertwined without pretense for the first time, that whatever came next would demand everything they had, and that for the first time since stepping into this life she wasn't afraid of the truth. The fallout did not explode. It crystallized, sharp and unmistakable, settling over the house the morning after the kiss with a stillness that felt more dangerous than shouting ever could. Harper sensed at the moment she woke, Charlotte's hand still entwined with hers beneath the covers, a quiet declaration neither of them had retracted in sleep, and when they rose together there was no attempt to re-establish distance, no scrambling back into performance, only a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted and could not be smoothed over with politeness. Downstairs, the atmosphere was precise, controlled. Eleanor already seated at the breakfast table with perfect posture and a smile that did not waver even as her eyes flicked immediately to their joined hands. Margaret beside her, Kane resting against the chair, gaze sharp and assessing, not surprised but intent, as if she had been waiting for this exact confirmation. Conversation was sparse, clipped, the usual warmth replaced by an efficiency that made Harper feel like an object being evaluated rather than a guest being hosted, and Charlotte noticed too, her shoulders tightening, her jaw setting with a determination Harper had never seen directed outward before. It was Margaret who spoke first, her voice calm and authoritative, remarking that appearances had finally caught up with reality, that secrets had a way of surfacing whether invited or not, and Eleanor followed with a softer, but no less pointed statement about how the family needed clarity, about how misunderstandings could be costly if allowed to linger. Harper felt the old instinct to shrink, to apologize for taking up space she was never meant to occupy, but Charlotte's grip on her hand tightened, grounding her, and Charlotte spoke before Harper could retreat, stating clearly that there was no misunderstanding, that what they saw was what it was, and that she would not entertain discussions framed as concern when they were rooted in control. The words hung heavy in the room, unprecedented in their directness, and Eleanor's composure cracked just enough to reveal genuine alarm, reminding Charlotte of responsibilities, of reputation, of the life she had been raised to carry, and Harper braced herself for the familiar pattern of Charlotte yielding, of fear stepping in where resolve faltered. It didn't happen. Instead, Charlotte stood, pulling Harper gently with her, and said quietly that she had spent her entire life being managed, softened, redirected, and that she would not allow her feelings to be treated as another inconvenience to be corrected. Margaret's eyes sharpened. Not with anger, but with recognition, and for a moment Harper thought she saw something like reluctant respect flicker there before it vanished behind practiced restraint. The confrontation ended without resolution, Eleanor excusing herself under the guise of a headache, Margaret advising patience in a tone that sounded more like warning than counsel, and Harper and Charlotte left the room together, the weight of what they'd just done settling slowly, heavily, but undeniably. The rest of the day unfolded under scrutiny, staff more reserved, Eleanor absent, relatives making polite excuses to keep their distance, and Harper felt the shift in how she was perceived. No longer charming novelty or harmless distraction, but a catalyst, a variable disrupting a carefully maintained equilibrium. The awareness was terrifying, but it was also clarifying, stripping away the illusion that she could remain untouched by the consequences of being here, and she realized that part of her had already chosen this path the moment she kissed Charlotte back. That evening, Charlotte confessed quietly that Eleanor had already begun making calls, damage control framed as concern, and Harper felt fear coiled tight in her chest, the reminder of her precarious position impossible to ignore, but when she suggested, haltingly, that maybe she should leave to make things easier, Charlotte's response was immediate and fierce, refusing outright, saying that losing Harper would not make anything easier. It would only confirm every fear she had ever been taught to obey. They argued then, softly but intensely, not about whether they cared, that truth now beyond dispute, but about cost, about fallout, about how much either of them was willing to lose. And Harper admitted through clenched teeth that she was afraid of being collateral damage in a war she hadn't started, while Charlotte admitted she was terrified of becoming the person who always chose safety over honesty. The argument didn't end cleanly, didn't resolve into reassurance, but it forged something raw and solid between them, a shared understanding that love, real love, was not the escape Harper had imagined but a confrontation, demanding presence rather than fantasy. That night, Margaret requested a private conversation with Harper alone, a summons that left Charlotte visibly tense but reluctantly compliant, and Harper followed the older woman into the study where generations of Ashford decisions seemed to watch from the walls. Margaret spoke without preamble, acknowledging Harper's impact, stating plainly that she had seen many relationships come and go, many rebellions burn bright and fade, and that Charlotte's happiness was not the same as her defiance, warning Harper that loving Charlotte would require endurance, not just passion. Harper listened, heart pounding, and answered with equal frankness that she was not looking to rescue Charlotte or be rescued, that she only wanted the chance to choose each other honestly, whatever that cost, and Margaret studied her for a long moment before nodding once, slowly, conceding that the family would not yield easily, but that respect was earned through consistency, not compliance. When Harper returned to Charlotte, the tension eased just enough for them to breathe again, the knowledge that they were now seen, truly seen, settling over them like both a burden and a promise, and as they lay together that night, not hiding, not pretending, Harper understood that the lie that had brought her here was finally collapsing, not in scandal, but in truth, and that the days ahead would test whether what they had chosen was strong enough to survive the world that would now push back. Pressure stopped pretending to be subtle. It arrived the next morning in the form of schedules, meetings, and conversations that excluded Harper by design, Eleanor moving through the house with renewed efficiency, phone calls whispered behind closed doors, plans rearranged without explanation, and Harper felt the deliberate narrowing of her space, the quiet message that she was no longer welcome to drift freely through a world that had decided she was a problem to be managed. Charlotte noticed, too, her jaw tightening each time Harper was gently redirected by staff or left out of conversations that once included her, and the anger simmering beneath Charlotte's composure felt volatile, unfamiliar, as though she were standing on the edge of a life she had never been allowed to imagine. The first tangible blow landed before noon, when Eleanor informed Harper with calm finality that the financial arrangement they had discussed earlier would be honored in full, $5,000 transferred immediately, along with a car scheduled to take her back to New York the following morning, framed as generosity, as closure, as a kindness that left no room for refusal. Harper's throat closed around the words she wanted to say, the instinct to accept, to retreat with dignity, warring violently with the truth of what she'd already chosen, and she asked quietly whether Charlotte knew, Eleanor's smile tightening as she replied that this was a family matter, implying that Charlotte's involvement was neither required nor desired. Harper left the room shaking, the weight of disposability pressing down hard, the familiar fear of being replaced, erased, resurfacing with brutal clarity. When she found Charlotte, the confrontation was immediate and explosive in a way nothing else had been, Charlotte's voice rising as she demanded answers, fury and betrayal cracking through years of obedience as Eleanor insisted she was protecting her daughter from a relationship that threatened her future, and Harper stood between them briefly before stepping back, realizing with painful clarity that this was Charlotte's battle to fight. Charlotte's decision came not as a speech but as an action, telling Eleanor she would not be attending the meeting scheduled for her that afternoon, canceling commitments with a sharp decisiveness that stunned everyone present, and declaring that if Harper left, it would not be alone, that Charlotte would go with her, family, fortune, and expectations be damned. The silence that followed was deafening, Eleanor's composure finally breaking, Margaret stepping in with measured authority to de-escalate, reminding Charlotte of consequences, of legal and financial realities, and Harper felt the gravity of it all settle in her bones, the realization that love here came with tangible costs, not just emotional ones. Later, alone together in the bedroom that now felt like both sanctuary and battlefield, Harper begged Charlotte not to do something she might regret, admitting that she couldn't bear the idea of being the reason Charlotte lost everything she'd built, and Charlotte listened, tears threatening but unshed, before confessing that everything she had built had been shaped to please others, that for once she needed to choose something that was hers, even if it meant starting over. They held each other then, not with the urgency of passion but with the steadiness of shared resolve, understanding that the future they were reaching for would not be easy, not safe, but honest. That night, Margaret requested another meeting, this time with both of them, laying out the realities plainly, trusts, expectations, the possibility of being cut off temporarily if Charlotte refused to comply, but also acknowledging that the family would not publicly disown her, appearances too valuable to risk, and Harper saw the calculation in it, control softened by pragmatism. Charlotte listened without flinching, thanked her grandmother for the honesty, and said she would not negotiate her relationship as if it were a liability. When they were finally alone again, Harper lay awake beside Charlotte, fear and hope twisting together in her chest, aware that the choice Charlotte had made was no longer symbolic, it was real, irreversible, and would test whether love could survive when stripped of comfort, security, and protection, and as dawn crept slowly toward the horizon, Harper understood that the hardest part was still ahead, not leaving the Ashford estate, but facing the world together without its shield. Morning came with a quiet that felt intentional, the kind of stillness that followed decisions made too loudly the night before, and Harper woke to Charlotte already dressed, sitting at the edge of the bed with her phone in hand, shoulders tense, expression focused in a way that made Harper's chest tighten before a single word was spoken. There were messages, emails, calls returned and unanswered, the machinery of consequence already in motion, and Charlotte didn't try to hide it, instead turning to Harper with an honesty that felt heavier than fear, telling her that some accounts had been frozen, that her assistant had been instructed to pause all non-essential arrangements, that certain doors were already closing even if no one had yet said the words out loud. Harper listened, heart pounding, and the old instinct surged hard, the need to step back, to make herself smaller, to remove herself before she became an anchor dragging Charlotte down, and she suggested softly that maybe this was the moment to take space, not because she wanted to leave, but because she loved Charlotte enough to not want to be the reason she lost everything at once. Charlotte reacted immediately, shaking her head, eyes bright with frustration and something dangerously close to panic, insisting that distance was exactly what her family wanted, that stepping away now would only reinforce their belief that this relationship was a phase, something fragile enough to be disrupted with pressure. The disagreement wasn't sharp, but it was deep, cutting along the same fault line they'd been circling for days. Harper afraid of being a burden, Charlotte terrified of abandonment dressed up as practicality, and when silence fell between them it felt heavier than any argument. The compromise came reluctantly, painfully, a temporary separation framed as necessity rather than surrender, Harper returning to New York for a short time to stabilize her own life, while Charlotte stayed to handle the immediate fallout, both of them agreeing it wasn't goodbye, but knowing how thin that promise felt against reality. Packing was quiet, restrained, every folded item carrying weight, every pause loaded with things neither of them trusted themselves to say, and when the car arrived, Harper hesitated on the steps, the mansion looming behind her, Charlotte standing rigid in the doorway as if afraid that moving would undo her resolve. They held each other then, tightly, desperately, the kind of embrace meant to imprint memory into muscle, and Charlotte whispered that this was not the end, that she would come to New York soon, that she would not let her family turn distance into erasure. Harper nodded, believing her because she needed to, because love without faith wasn't survivable, and when the car finally pulled away she didn't look back, afraid that if she did she might break completely. New York greeted her with cold and chaos, the familiar noise grounding and cruel all at once, and Harper returned to her small apartment feeling changed, like someone who had stepped briefly into another life and come back carrying its weight. She deposited the money that now felt less like payment and more like severance, paid overdue bills, sent out job applications with renewed urgency, forcing herself into motion because stillness made room for doubt, for the fear that she had been easy to discard after all. Days passed with too little communication, short messages from Charlotte squeezed between meetings with lawyers and family intermediaries, reassurances clipped by exhaustion, and Harper struggled not to read distance into brevity, reminding herself that this was the cost of choosing each other honestly, that endurance was part of what Margaret had warned her about. One evening, alone in the cafe where it had all begun, Harper allowed herself to cry quietly into her coffee, the grief of separation mixing painfully with hope, and she realized that loving Charlotte meant accepting uncertainty as the price of truth. Back in Connecticut, Charlotte faced the reality she had long avoided, meetings with advisors, conversations with Margaret that were no longer about control but consequence, and the slow dismantling of a life designed around obedience, and for the first time, she didn't feel relief at the idea of escape. She felt grief, mourning the version of herself she'd been forced to abandon to become someone capable of choosing love. When Charlotte finally stood alone in her bedroom, the bed too large without Harper beside her, she understood with aching clarity that distance was not the threat her family believed it to be, indifference was, and she refused to let that take root. She booked a ticket quietly, decisively, not yet ready to announce it, but certain now that this separation was not a retreat. It was a test, and she intended to pass it. Time did not soften the distance. It sharpened it, turning every unanswered message into a question, and every short reply into a test of faith Harper had to consciously pass again and again. New York moved fast, indifferent to heartbreak, and Harper threw herself into its rhythm, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant wondering whether choosing Charlotte had been brave or foolish. She found work sooner than expected, not glamorous, not permanent, but enough to anchor her days, enough to remind her that she could survive on her own, that she had always known how to land on her feet even when the ground shifted beneath her. At night, though, the quiet crept in, filling the small apartment with echoes of Connecticut, of silk sheets and whispered promises, of Charlotte's steady presence beside her, and Harper lay awake scrolling through old messages, rereading the way Charlotte had written her name as if it were something precious. Their communication settled into a fragile pattern, voice notes sent late when exhaustion stripped pretense away, brief calls where they talked about mundane things because their real fears felt too big to say aloud, and Harper learned to hear everything Charlotte wasn't saying, the strain, the pressure, the loneliness mirrored so closely in her own chest it almost hurt to breathe. In Connecticut, Charlotte navigated a world that no longer felt like hers, meetings with lawyers and advisors replacing social obligations, Margaret becoming less an authority and more an observer, watching to see whether Charlotte's resolve would fracture or harden under sustained pressure. Eleanor kept her distance, her disappointment expressed through absence rather than confrontation, a strategy that hurt more than open conflict ever could, and Charlotte realized how much of her life had been shaped by the fear of that silence. She began making small, deliberate changes, moving funds where she could, canceling long-term commitments, exploring the logistics of independence with the same meticulous care she'd once applied to pleasing others, and each step felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The first real crack in Harper's resolve came on a night when exhaustion won, when she admitted aloud to an empty room that she missed Charlotte not as an idea or a promise, but as a person. The way she took her coffee, the way she listened without interrupting, the way her presence made space feel safer, and the realization that love did not pause politely just because distance demanded it scared her more than anything else. She almost called Charlotte then, almost asked for reassurance she wasn't sure she deserved, but stopped herself, understanding that leaning too hard might pull them both apart. Instead, she wrote a long message she didn't send, pouring every doubt and hope into words meant only to exist, and slept with the ache still unresolved. Charlotte felt the shift even without knowing why, the pull toward New York growing stronger with each day, the conviction settling slowly but firmly that she was not meant to fight this battle alone from behind ancestral walls. When she finally told Margaret she intended to leave Connecticut for an extended stay, not as rebellion but as reorientation, the older woman studied her with a long, searching look before nodding once, acknowledging that permanence was not the same as purpose, and that perhaps it was time Charlotte learned the difference. The decision was not announced publicly, not framed as scandal or escape, simply enacted, tickets booked, plans adjusted, staff informed, and Eleanor notified last, her reaction muted, her disappointment heavy, but no longer enough to redirect Charlotte's path. Harper didn't know any of this until a single message arrived late one night, simple and unembellished. "I'm coming to New York, not to visit, not to escape, but to choose," and Harper stared at the screen for a long time, fear and relief colliding so violently, she had to sit down. The distance had forced them both to confront who they were without the other, to decide whether love was an addition or a necessity, and as Harper typed back with trembling fingers, she understood that whatever happened next would no longer be shaped by lies or obligation, but by two people willing to meet each other on equal ground, finally ready to see whether what they had survived apart could hold them together. New York did not pause for reunions. It roared, indifferent and relentless, swallowing Charlotte the moment she stepped out of the cab and onto the cracked pavement outside Harper's building, the noise and movement a sharp contrast to the controlled quiet of Connecticut. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, coat pulled tight, suitcase at her side, heart pounding with a mixture of certainty and fear she hadn't felt since the day she'd first walked into that cafe. This time there was no lie to cushion the risk, no family expectation to hide behind, only the knowledge that if this failed there would be no one to blame but herself. Harper saw her from the window before she heard the buzz, the familiar shape rendered suddenly unreal by proximity, and for a second she couldn't move, the distance of weeks collapsing violently into a single point of recognition that stole her breath. When she opened the door, they stared at each other in silence, the weight of everything unsaid stretching taut between them, until Harper stepped forward and Charlotte followed, arms wrapping around each other with a force that bordered on desperation, the embrace grounding and overwhelming all at once. They didn't kiss immediately. This reunion felt heavier than that, charged with the need to confirm reality before surrendering to emotion, and when they finally pulled back, Harper searched Charlotte's face for doubt and found only exhaustion and resolve in equal measure. Inside the apartment, the difference between their worlds became impossible to ignore. The cramped space, the mismatched furniture, the hum of traffic through thin walls, and Charlotte took it in quietly, reverently, as if this modest room held more truth than any mansion ever had. She admitted then that she had no grand plan beyond staying, beyond learning how to live without the scaffolding she'd always relied on, and Harper listened, torn between admiration and fear, the awareness that love here would be practical, unglamorous, tested daily by reality. The days that followed were not cinematic. They were awkward, tender, frustrating, filled with small negotiations and unspoken adjustments, Charlotte learning how to exist without staff, Without structure, Harper learning how to share her space and routines with someone whose life experience was so different from her own. Tensions surfaced unexpectedly in conversations about money, about timelines, about how long Charlotte intended to stay, Harper bristling at the idea of being a temporary refuge, Charlotte flinching at any implication that she might leave once things became uncomfortable. They argued quietly one night, voices low, frustration sharpened by fear, Harper accusing Charlotte of romanticizing struggle, Charlotte accusing Harper of underestimating her willingness to adapt, and the argument ended not with resolution but with honesty, both of them admitting they were terrified of failing each other now that the fantasy had fallen away. What followed was slower, steadier, intimacy built not on secrecy or rebellion but on shared routines, grocery lists, late-night conversations on the fire escape, Charlotte taking a temporary consulting role that bruised her pride but anchored her days, Harper watching her navigate humility with a grace that felt earned rather than inherited. Love here was not loud. It was persistent, showing up in small choices, in apologies offered quickly, in the decision to stay even when staying was hard. Still, uncertainty lingered, unspoken but present, the question of whether Charlotte would one day miss the world she'd left behind, whether Harper would always feel like a compromise rather than a destination. One evening, as they lay together listening to the city breathe around them, Charlotte admitted she'd been invited to a family event in the spring, not as a demand but as an opening, and Harper felt the old fear stir, the worry that this was the beginning of a slow return. Charlotte didn't promise anything she couldn't keep. She simply said she didn't know yet, that she was learning to choose in real time instead of defaulting to expectation, and Harper realized that this uncertainty was not a threat but a test of trust, one that could only be passed together. As the city lights flickered outside the window, Harper understood that loving Charlotte in the real world meant accepting complexity without retreating, and Charlotte understood that staying meant more than proximity. It meant consistency, and though neither of them knew exactly where this path would lead, they knew now that they were walking it side by side, not out of obligation or defiance, but because they wanted to see if what they had built could survive without walls, without wealth, without lies. The past did not knock when it returned. It slipped in quietly through an email that arrived on Charlotte's phone one gray afternoon while Harper was at work. Subject line polite, wording careful, unmistakably Ashford. An invitation to the spring gathering, framed not as an obligation but as reconciliation, a chance to move forward without spectacle, Margaret's language unmistakable beneath the formality, measured, strategic, leaving room for choice while reminding Charlotte of everything that still waited for her if she chose to step back inside that world. Charlotte stared at the screen for a long time, the city humming outside the window, the small apartment suddenly feeling too tight for the weight of what that message represented, because this wasn't a threat or an ultimatum, it was something far more dangerous, an olive branch offered only after Charlotte had proven she was capable of walking away. When Harper came home that evening, she felt it immediately, the tension coiled beneath Charlotte's calm, the way she moved through the apartment distracted, distant, and when Charlotte finally told her about the invitation, the silence that followed was heavy, loaded with memories neither of them needed to name. Harper listened carefully, heart racing despite her effort to stay grounded, because this was the moment she'd feared without fully admitting it, the point where Charlotte would have to decide whether her life with Harper was enough, without the counterweight of legacy and approval. They talked late into the night, not arguing, not pleading, but circling the truth with painful honesty, Harper admitting she was afraid this was the beginning of a return she couldn't follow, Charlotte confessing she didn't know yet what attending would mean, only that ignoring it felt like leaving something unfinished inside herself. The next days were tense in a quieter way, the city moving on around them while uncertainty settled between shared meals and half-finished conversations, Harper fighting the instinct to pull back emotionally, to protect herself by assuming the worst, Charlotte struggling with the guilt of wanting closure without wanting to lose what she had built. When Charlotte finally decided to go, not for reconciliation but for clarity, Harper surprised herself by agreeing, the decision born not of confidence but of trust hard-won and fragile, telling Charlotte she would not ask her to choose preemptively, that whatever choice mattered had to be made freely, or it would poison them both. The gathering itself unfolded with restrained civility, no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, only carefully measured conversations and watchful eyes, Eleanor polite but distant, Margaret incisive as ever, and Charlotte standing among them with a composure that felt different now, less brittle, less rehearsed, speaking openly about her life in New York, her work, her relationship, refusing to minimize Harper's place in it even when discomfort flickered across familiar faces. It was Margaret who pulled Charlotte aside near the end, acknowledging quietly that love chosen without coercion was rarer than love approved, warning her that independence came with loneliness as well as freedom, but conceding that Charlotte had finally stopped living as a reflection of someone else's expectations. When Charlotte returned to New York days later, Harper met her not with questions but with presence, the tension breaking only when Charlotte admitted she hadn't felt tempted to stay, only relieved to leave, and Harper exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks. Still, something lingered unresolved, not about the family but about them, the understanding that surviving this moment did not guarantee permanence, only possibility, and as they lay together that night Harper confessed her fear of being a chapter rather than a lifetime, while Charlotte admitted her fear of promising permanence before she'd fully learned how to live without escape routes. They didn't solve it then, didn't tie the uncertainty into something neat, but they stayed, choosing not certainty but commitment in motion, understanding that the final test was no longer the Ashfords or the past, it was whether they could continue choosing each other without guarantees. And as the city lights flickered outside the window, they held each other with a quiet intensity that felt like standing on the edge of a truth that could no longer be delayed. Charlotte did not announce her decision with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. She lived into it quietly, deliberately, letting the shape of her days answer the question she had been avoiding for most of her life. Weeks passed after the spring gathering, the city settling into warmer rhythms, windows opening, light lingering longer, and Harper watched Charlotte change in ways that were subtle but profound, the tension that once lived permanently in her shoulders easing, the constant readiness to flee or appease slowly dissolving into something steadier. They built routines that felt earned rather than assumed, mornings crowded in the small kitchen, shared calendars taped to the fridge, conversations about the future that no longer stopped at what if, but moved cautiously toward when. Harper still carried fear, the old reflex of bracing for loss ingrained too deeply to vanish overnight, but she noticed how Charlotte showed up consistently, not with promises but with presence, coming home when she said she would, choosing hard conversations instead of silence, making space for Harper's doubts without retreating from them. The final reckoning came unexpectedly, not from the Ashfords but from within Charlotte herself. One quiet evening when she admitted she had been offered a path back into her family's world, not as surrender but as negotiation, partial access restored if she maintained distance, kept her life compartmentalized, love acknowledged but not centered. Charlotte spoke calmly, almost clinically, as if laying out terms in a contract she already knew she wouldn't sign, and Harper listened with a tight chest, preparing herself for disappointment she refused to voice. When Charlotte finished, she didn't ask Harper what to do. Instead, she said simply that for the first time she understood the cost clearly, not just what she might lose, but what she would give up if she accepted a life built on halves. She said she was tired of living with one foot always pointed toward an exit, tired of loving cautiously, tired of confusing safety with happiness. Harper broke then, not into tears but into honesty, admitting that she had spent her whole life believing she was temporary, easy to leave, and that loving Charlotte had forced her to confront that fear daily, but that she would rather face it with Charlotte than protect herself alone. Charlotte took Harper's face in her hands with a gentleness that felt reverent, telling her that home was not a place she returned to anymore. It was something she was building, and that Harper was not a chapter, not a rebellion, not a compromise. She was the choice. The words landed not as fantasy but as fact, solid and grounding, and when Charlotte followed them with action, formally declining the offer, restructuring her finances fully, committing to a life untethered from conditional approval, Harper understood that this was the resolution she had been waiting for, not perfection, not certainty, but alignment. The months that followed were not effortless, but they were real. Harper finding stability in her work, Charlotte carving out a career defined by intention rather than inheritance, both of them learning how to argue without threatening departure, how to dream without apology. On a warm evening, nearly a year after a desperate meeting in a cafe, Harper and Charlotte stood together on the fire escape, city lights stretching endlessly before them, and Harper realized that the fear that once dominated her had softened into something manageable, a reminder rather than a ruler. Charlotte leaned into her, fingers lacing naturally with Harper's, and said that she no longer measured her life by what she had escaped, but by what she had chosen to stay for. Harper smiled then, a quiet, full smile, understanding that the lie that had brought them together had dissolved completely, replaced by a truth neither of them had anticipated, but both of them had earned. They did not need an audience, a mansion, or approval to validate what they had built. Their happiness lived in shared mornings, mutual resilience, and the unwavering decision to keep choosing each other, and as the city breathed around them, Harper knew with certainty that this story, unlike all the ones she had feared before, was not temporary, it was home. Thank you so much for being here and for believing in this channel. If you feel in your heart, you can donate with super thanks so I can focus more and more on this project. Your support helps me keep creating these love stories and bringing them to life for you. See you in the next video.